Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Mackenzie Mallon, and I'm the provenance specialist here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. This evening's talk is held in conjunction with the exhibition Discriminating Thieves, Nazi-Looted Art and Restitution, which is generously supported by the Neil D. Carbank Foundation. Discriminating Thieves is currently on view upstairs in Gallery P10, so if you haven't yet had the opportunity to see the exhibition, I want to invite you to do so either after the talk or at some point in the future. It will be on view through January of 2020. I also encourage you to come back the final 3 weekends in March for our related film series. The weekend of March 15th, 16th, we will show Hitler versus Picasso and the Others, which is a new film on the Nazi degenerate art campaign. The weekend of March 22nd, 23rd, we will show The Rape of Europa, which is a documentary based on the groundbreaking book of the same name. And on March 29th, 30th, we will show the popular film Woman in Gold with Helen Mirren. So make sure you get your free tickets online for all of those shows at nelson-atkins.org. It's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Corine Wegener. Corine is director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, or SCRI, an outreach program dedicated to the preservation of cultural heritage in crisis situations in the US and abroad. SCRI's work includes projects in Syria, Iraq, Haiti, Nepal, and around the world. SCRI also co-chairs with FEMA's Office of Environmental and Historic Preservation the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is part of the U.S. National Disaster Recovery Framework. Before coming to the Smithsonian in 2012, Corine was an associate curator in the Department of Decorative Arts, Textiles, and Sculpture at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. During a concurrent career in the U.S. Army Reserve, she served on several military deployments, including as an Arts, Monuments, and Archives officer assigned to assist after the 2003 looting of the Iraq National Museum. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Nebraska-Omaha and MA degrees in political science and art history from the University of Kansas. So she's on familiar ground here in Kansas City. Please welcome Corine Wegener.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you so much for being here on this chilly evening. I really appreciate it. I am on familiar and even maybe comfortable ground being here at the Nelson-Atkins. I'm originally from Missouri, from Lexington, Missouri, and the Nelson-Atkins was my very first art museum experience as a kid. And so I guess you can all feel comfortable being involved with the Nelson-Atkins in that you really do inspire young people to go off and do some interesting things in their lives. So I'd also like to thank Mackenzie and my longtime friend Catherine Footer, who is the chief curator here at the Nelson-Atkins, for inviting me here tonight. And I was privileged to see the Discriminating Thieves exhibit this afternoon, and I really, really enjoyed it. And so I'm hoping that this will inspire you to go see it if you haven't already. So it's really hard to talk beyond the Monuments Men unless you talk about World War II, and a little bit about the Monuments Men first. So World War II was this moment, and the years leading up to it, where there was a real worry about the devastating effect of armed conflict that was beginning in the 1930s and the kind of spurring on World War II. And that was partly because World War I had had such devastating weaponry, such as the world had never seen before. And so as the Nazi regimes began its war machine and began effectively, systematically looting works of art and decrying the rise of what they called degenerate art and using that as a tool to suppress people and to steal their art collections, the rest of the world got very nervous, as you would expect. And our European colleagues across the ocean began to worry about their own collections and what they would do to protect them if indeed that became necessary. And so a lot of measures were taken early on with advice and assistance from colleagues here in the United States and throughout Europe about what one should do if they're preparing for war and you have these enormous art museum collections. So you see here the galleries being cleaned out in the Louvre, and actually France was invaded sort of right in the middle of its evacuation of some of these great art treasures. You see here in Italy the walling up of the important Michelangelo's David and the Accademia. The Last Supper in Milan was carefully sandbagged, and you see here the amazing framework that actually saved it from an accidental Allied bombing later on. And our colleagues in the UK they waited and they planned to evacuate the British Museum, and actually they had 6 days notice of the entry of the UK into World War II, and had to put those plans into effect very quickly. And you see here on the left, I was recently provided a copy of this by one of my colleagues that's working with the Monuments Men in the UK, this guide to protecting of art treasures in war areas. And so luckily the British Museum was able to evacuate the vast majority of its collections up to the north of England, and luckily so, because they were bombed I think it was 6 times during the Blitz, and they did lose some of their immovable collections. So this did not go unnoticed by our colleagues here in the United States working in museums, and part of what I hope to impart to you tonight is how important the art museum, and not just art museums, but museums in general, were to the war effort even before the US entered the conflict, and then obviously for years afterward with the Monuments Men. And that came about partly because of the Harvard University had an important group of scholars that determined, because the president of Harvard was so active and a big proponent of supporting the US war effort, that they created this Harvard group to support the war. And within that was the Paul Sachs from the Fogg Museum at Harvard University. And so he had been very active. Some of you may know him. He was a very famous teacher of art historians, and particularly his museum studies program at Harvard had some of the top names in the field later on, as he seemed to draw. I don't know if he's kind of the creator, the brainchild of the Monuments Men, between him and George Stout, who also worked at the Fogg Museum, who I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. He kind of was the creator of the whole art museum leadership from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He had his mark on all of them. Henry Francis Taylor from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the leading art museums in the country, was a huge advocate of trying to work with colleagues overseas and for helping the US military understand the need to protect these important cultural sites if the US should become involved in World War II. And then the National Gallery of Art was fairly new at this time. They hadn't really even opened when the bombing of Pearl Harbor took place. And so they were also a real leader in the Washington, D.C. area, working with the Smithsonian and others. These 3 guys were very involved even before Pearl Harbor in trying to ensure, to work with government, to work with the group of museum leaders in trying to both figure out what the US would do if we were called upon to protect our own heritage sites, but also how to work with colleagues overseas. And so then we have the advent of Pearl Harbor happening and US museums trying to figure out, wow, we are really going to be in this conflict now. And so thinking, the Roberts Commission, I should have explained briefly, was created really by the US government, and it was named the Roberts Commission because it was led by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Roberts, But really the leadership of that group included the three museum directors I just showed you and a number of other like-minded colleagues, but it was really based out of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So when Pearl Harbor happened, American museums really started to think about this, and Henry Francis Taylor had a big meeting in December, just a few weeks after, to have the leadership of American museums come together and think about their stance. What would American museums do? And they determined during those meetings that they should stay open to the public. They should not shut down. They should not evacuate their collections, in part because, as a show of confidence, that there needed to be a place where Americans could go for a respite from the war effort, for a respite from their hard work, and that they needed to be there for the American people. However, sort of surreptitiously, some of the most important sort of top 100 paintings from the National Gallery of Art ended up being evacuated to Biltmore, a little ways off the beaten path. And this is my dream job, right? Some curators got to stay at Biltmore with these paintings for the duration of the war. Such a lovely time. And you can still go, this particular part at these rooms at Biltmore still have signage that indicate that this is the area where the National Gallery of Art materials were kept. The Smithsonian, also a little bit guilty, sent some of our most treasured national treasures out to the Smoky Mountains for storage for the duration of the war. And this is a picture of that facility. So who's seen the Monuments Men? Yay, okay, I assumed in this crowd. So if you're here, probably the Monuments Men tagline lured you just a little bit. So love it or hate it, and I've heard a lot of both, and I have my own mixed feelings, the Monuments Men movie really brought to the forefront of like public awareness of the heroic efforts of the arts monument, or I should say Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives teams of World War II. And while the storyline is on the fictional side, if you read the actual Monuments Men book, you get the true characters and the true story. But we do like that Matt Damon and all the handsome fellows, George Clooney, etc. But the real Monuments Men and women, while maybe not quite as handsome, maybe not quite as beautiful, were actually, in some ways, I feel like they got short shrift with the film, mainly because there was this idea that they were, this ragtag group of heroes. Somebody's told me that it's Ocean's 11 meets Kelly's Heroes. But that they actually just kind of pulled them off the street. And the reality is most of them, for the most part, were already serving in the military in some capacity. And I'd like to talk about that just for a moment. So George Stout was the George Clooney character, right? That's who he really represented. He was at the Fogg Museum at Harvard, one of the early pioneers in conservation science there. And he really had the idea of the Monuments Men early on. He thought of them more as technicians, people, special workmen, I think he called them, that should go and assist as the U.S. military went into Europe. And after a while, it just seemed like this wasn't going to happen. He had this idea very early on after the U.S. entered the war. And by 1942 or so, he kind of got tired of waiting around. And he was a veteran of World War I and had stayed in the Navy Reserve the entire time between World War I and World War II. So I feel like George Clooney's character kind of gave him short shrift because he was a veteran for decades. And he was 45 years old when he went to war. That part's true. Monuments Men were old. And they tend to be today also, I have to say. So anyway, George Stout, a hero of, he was really the founding father of the Monuments Men, even if it was really his boss that made it happen and had the access to the people to tell the military, these are the people we've trained and this is who should be in the Monuments Men. James Rorimer, Also was actively serving in the infantry as a lieutenant when he finally got called up for service with the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives teams. He went on to be director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this is just an idea of who was serving, and I won't go into great detail. There's great films that you can see. You're going to have a chance to see The Rape of Europa coming up here, which is wonderful. And then a lot of books that you can read to get more detail about this. But I wanted to just give a shout out to the Nelson-Atkins Museum Monuments Men, because I think the Nelson-Atkins had one of the largest concentrations of monuments men from its staff that I know of, and there were 4 actually on the list. So basically, what I understand is the founding director really of the Nelson-Atkins, Paul Gardner, or Joseph Paul Gardner, was director of the Nelson-Atkins, volunteered to go to war, and basically, you can see he was no spring chicken at this time, and really worked throughout the war, and then came back and took up his post again as director. Major Lawrence Chalfont, Stephen Sickman. I love his bomber jacket, by the way. It's just, he is very suave. Curator of Chinese art, really helped build the collection here to the amazing collection that it is today, and was able to, work in Asia and did all kinds of amazing things. Patrick Joseph Kelleher, U.S. Army. He later went on to be director at the Princeton University Art Museum. And then this is my kind of favorite. Major Whitman was in the Office of Strategic Services, which was essentially the precursor to the CIA, right? So curator of prints here, and later spent the rest of his career at the Toledo Museum of Art. But he did an amazing amount to coordinate the efforts of the OSS to interview and figure out what the Nazis were doing with the looted art. And basically that investigative part, working with the monuments men, he wasn't actually in uniformed himself, but he did a lot to make sure that they could do their work well. So what did the monuments men do? Well, first of all, even before the U.S. Really had created the Civil Affairs Division with the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives, there was a big effort from the American College of Learned Societies, ACLS, working with the Frick Museum, which basically was closed to the public, but made their entire library and archive collection available to scholars, specifically to help with military mapping of cultural sites in Europe. So this is just one example of that. This is a map of Antwerp, and scholars volunteered to come there and work with that collection and archive and to be able to make these maps. That basic effort, and this was done for Italy and a number of other countries, and that basic effort even led into creating, real official military manuals that could be used by the monuments men and during the invasion of Europe and moving on into Germany. They were also very active once the U.S. invaded Europe in going along, and this is still the case today. I think the movie also gave a little bit of a mistaken view that the monuments men had their own little group and they could go wherever they want and do whatever they wanted. But, as you saw in the movie, George Clooney couldn't even get a Jeep when he wanted to, and that's partly because civil affairs teams of all kinds, they have all kinds of different expertise today in civil affairs. Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives is just one small part of that. But they have to stay with sort of the big division commanders that they're attached to. And so, but what would happen is the monuments men team, which sometimes they were only 1 or 2 people, would go with the divisions, and as they went through these areas, they would go in right after and try to help save some of the monuments and the religious sites. And here you see an evacuation of a religious sculpture from a church. So they did a lot of that kind of work. They also tried to keep our own soldiers from destroying things, because nobody can destroy something like a soldier, I'm telling you. They will make their bedroom there, they will leave food around. So this basically was their job, to go around and tell the military where they could not use for billeting, where they could not use for headquarters, etc. It wasn't always successful. I think Eisenhower himself was one of the worst offenders. He shot a rat once in his palace. He was staying in a palace and shot a rat, and everybody was like, "Sir, you know this is like from the 1600s, right?" But he did lend his authority and name to what the Monuments Men were doing, even to the point of telling commanders, look, we're invading a country that really values its cultural heritage, and it's our shared cultural heritage. So he made it a point to tell his commanders that the doctrine of military necessity was really important. If it's necessary and it saves our men's lives, yes, sometimes you have to damage cultural heritage, but he did not want that to be a substitute for slackness or laziness. He told people, you will be called to task on this, I assure you. So also the Monuments Men found, as they were pushing into Europe and pushing on toward Berlin, they found a lot of these caches of stolen art or even German museum collections that had been sent to salt mines and various places for storage, safekeeping. And then they were responsible, right? They had to catalog this material. They would call in the Monuments Men. This is a young Harry Ettlinger, so you remember the translator from the Monuments Men? This is the real guy, Harry Ettlinger. And they were responsible for moving these vast collections of material out of these places and to some of the central collecting points that were set up in and around Germany. And then after that, they had to figure out how to restitute these works of art to their countries of origin. And it was no mean task. And there were US military and civilian federal employees working in Europe until well into the 1950s doing this work. This is James Rorimer at Neuschwanstein Castle doing some evacuation of collections. And then this is one of the collecting points. I think this is the Munich Central Collecting Point. And I look at this and I kind of see like one person looks like they fell asleep at their desk. Just saying, it's not always excitement. But their work, while not always successful, they didn't save 100% of works of art, but they worked very hard to make sure that when they could find the records, things were properly restituted. And this is why today you can go to Poland and see Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, even today, because of the efforts that they made. So, what happened then? After the world realized, wow, things can go really, really wrong in a huge scale armed conflict like that. Millions and millions of people died. You have to look at that reality, and you can't always worry about cultural property and what the impact is on that. But they also recognize that the traditional laws of war, the Geneva and Hague Conventions, were broken over and over again, and that more attention perhaps should be made to the protection of cultural property. And so in 1954, the states parties of the world, the countries of the world, came together in The Hague in the Netherlands to create a convention, a treaty, which was the first time we had a treaty just for the protection of cultural property in armed conflict. And it was really based on, in a lot of ways, the work of the Monuments Men and what people felt was successful and what wasn't. So it goes to this. You don't have to read all this. I thought it would be nice for the YouTubers later on to be able to have a freeze frame and they could write it down. But it defines cultural property. What do we mean by that? It means all types of cultural places, works of art, museums, archives, libraries, archaeological sites, even scientific collections, etc., and any repositories. And it also means urban landscapes, which are like historic cities. And then it tells the states parties, okay, what do you have to do? If you're a states party, you are agreeing to certain conditions that you will fulfill. And that one of them is to safeguard cultural property. So during peacetime, and I'm gonna do this army thing where I stomp my foot on the floor, like, remember this. During peacetime, you are supposed to plan for the possibility of war. And every country that's a member of the Hague Convention is supposed to do that. That means a domestic responsibility for who? People like me, people who are curators, people who are museum directors. We're supposed to be preparing. It's good practice anyway. You could have a fire, or you could have a tornado, etc. But also, while we might think the possibility of armed conflict is low for our own domestic practice, think about those museums in World War II that had to finally realize, wow, maybe bombers could reach our shores, or think about 9/11. So this is part of it. Is you can't just sit around and be lazy and wait to make sure, oh, well, it's the other guy's fault if my cultural property gets damaged. You have to take time to protect it yourself. And then the respect, so that you won't use cultural property for a military purpose. For instance, you're not supposed to use a museum as a military headquarters, because once it has a military use, it loses that protection under international law. And there is, you're given a military necessity exception. You don't have to stand there and get shot at just because you're standing in front of a cultural heritage site or something. You can defend yourself and protect yourself. But you also have to take measures to prohibit your soldiers from doing damage. And also, if you're in charge, if you're an occupying force, you have to take measures to protect that cultural property. And you're not supposed to direct any kind of fire or activity toward cultural property if you don't have to. And then finally, this is the part that relates back to the monuments men. Article 7 covers the military measures, and this was really written because there are, minutes of these meetings, and you can go and read them even today about the reason they did Article 7 is because they said the monuments men were successful because they were part of the military. They were uniformed people who had a seat at the table in the staff meetings, and so we need them to be part of what we're doing. We need these cultural specialists within the armed forces who will secure that respect for cultural heritage, who will train other soldiers about the need for that respect, and then we'll be able to fulfill the obligations under the Hague Convention. So each state's party to Hague is supposed to have within its military some people like the World War II monuments men who have that understanding and capability. And then the Hague Convention also includes an international protective symbol of the blue shield, and it's mentioned, it's laid out in the convention what it should look like. Roughly, it should look like that, blue and white symbol. This is on the right is the roof of the Iraq National Museum as photographed in 2003 when U.S. forces arrived there. On the left is the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. So the blue shield is really like the Red Cross, but for culture. The Red Cross is the symbol of the Geneva Convention for humanitarian aid during armed conflict, and it's kind of become known as the medical symbol because it's the protective symbol for medical personnel in armed conflict. The blue shield can be used the same way. It's a protective symbol. It can even be worn as an arm patch by cultural property workers, cultural property professionals in the course of protecting culture in armed conflict. Did it work? Well, we've had a lot of damage to cultural property since 1954, I think we'll all agree. We had the Bosnia conflict, which really was a moment when cultural property was intentionally targeted as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign. If you wipe out a people, you need to wipe out the records of those people, you need to wipe out their library books, you need to wipe out their synagogues, their mosques, etc. We had the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and in 2003, the looting of the Iraq Museum. And this was theft of cultural property from the Iraq National Museum, the flagship museum of Iraq, and it was also deliberate destruction of certain pieces within the museum. And this was, the looters were people from the neighborhood, but they were also people who went to the museum with the idea in mind that they would be stealing some of the collection. Some of the most important works of art in the history of the world were taken during that looting. The head of Warka is in pretty much every art history 101 book that I've seen coming along as an art historian. And that's just one example of many. So, Monuments Men. Here you see me as a very naive young major. In 2003, I got the call while I was working for the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and I had to go tell my boss, director then Evan Maurer, I guess I'm getting deployed to Iraq, so I hope I still have a job when I get back. And he said, of course, of course. And the MIA was very supportive of me while I was there. But I had no idea, this was my first day on the job, how hard it would be. But as you can imagine, the staff that I met up with and the archaeologists from all over the world that I met up with were not very happy. So I didn't quite get the welcome of George Clooney and the Monuments Men. I got the, what the heck happened here? And this is the grand sum total of the Monuments Men in Iraq in sort of May 2003. This is my colleague Wes Sumner. He's now a colonel running around having fun times somewhere in the active army. But he's a landscape archaeologist, and I an art historian, and this kind of made up our little team. And then we had a team that we also worked with regularly on cultural issues, but this was all of the trained, academically trained folks we had. And so my job was to work regularly with the museum to try to get as much of the collection back as we could. We worked a lot with military police. We worked with a team called JIASIC, the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, which some of you may have read Colonel Matthew Bogdanos' book, Thieves of Baghdad. He was in charge of that team. And then when our team from Civil Affairs arrived, they kind of they finished their investigation and went on their way. And then we continued to work with the museum to try to help them with the recovery. This is then Director Donnie George. And not unlike the Monuments Men, we had a lot of international colleagues that we worked with. My boss was a Italian ambassador who was sent to become the occupation minister of culture of Iraq, which was very interesting since he didn't have any cultural background. But he did speak Arabic. And so we worked with the Carabinieri, and this is one of the Carabinieri who were helping us try to document the losses and try to pull together a full inventory of the museum. We went to dark, dank places to look for collections. This is the National Bank, where the treasure of Nimrud was stored, and there was a lot of worry that it had been looted from the National Bank. The National Bank was unfortunately bombed during the coalition invasion. It was one of the few sites holding cultural property that had happened to, but also somebody tried to blow the doors off of that safe you just saw with a rocket-propelled grenade and did not survive the attempt. If you know anything about RPGs, do not fire in an enclosed space. Just pro tip. This was a really happy day where we found out that collection was totally intact, and we were able to put it on view very briefly at the Iraq National Museum, and it really raised morale a lot. But in my 9 months in Iraq, I saw a little bit of joy there, but the devastation to Iraqi cultural heritage was huge. Many, many archaeological sites were looted. We had damage to an amazing historic site, you may have heard of it, called Babylon, where the U.S. military, in some effort to protect it, but also being strategic ground, we built a military base on top of it and damaged it very much. And so we're still working to try to reverse that harm. So I saw a lot of things that I thought, wow, how did this happen? The Monuments Men were my heroes. I read Lynn Nicholas's book, The Rape of Europa, when I was in grad school. How did this happen? And I wanted to understand more, but the biggest thing I learned that was a huge disappointment was that even though the U.S. had worked on the text of the Hague Convention and even were the ones to say we need to do it and put the text in there because we need the Monuments Men, we need that, the United States had never ratified that treaty. And I learned that while I was in Iraq, and I thought, okay, I'm a museum curator, I'm in the Army, and I'm 40 years old at the time. How did I not know this? How did I not know the US had never ratified this treaty? So I was really determined when I got back to try to rally the colleagues, my cultural heritage colleagues, who were so critical of what happened with the US invasion and the looting of the Iraq Museum. But at the same time, I said, we have a responsibility. How does the US military understand where these sites are, understand their importance, if we don't tell them? It's our job to educate our military. I've now read the Hague Convention, and it says right in there, you have to institute military training and education about this. Well, who's going to do it if we as cultural heritage professionals don't do it? And I will admit, I had a foot in both camps, but I really felt like we could do better. So I created, with a group of various colleagues, the U.S. Committee for the Blue Shield. It's part of an international group that was formed in the 1990s as sort of the Red Cross for culture, and they call themselves the Blue Shield, and there are national committees in several countries. And we offered, particularly at the time, we were formed in 2006, and we started offering to any deploying civil affairs unit cultural property training. We raised some money, and we said, we will come wherever you need us, whether it's at Fort Bragg, MacDill, Air Force Base, wherever you need us to come. If there's a deploying unit, we will come there and train them. So we did many hundreds of people got trained on their way going back to Iraq, going to Afghanistan, going to the Horn of Africa. And we recruited other museum colleagues to do it. We recruited archaeologists. And then since then, we've been doing a lot of training at museums. This is at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian a few years ago. This one too, I love this Uncle Sam picture. These are Marines, they love that stuff. So some of our Army colleagues, so you know, the whole Smithsonian has pitched into this, and we can go to all different museums and ask for them to host these trainings, and they are happy to do so. I did not know that much about natural history specimens. Now I know more than I want to, and so do these Marines, you can tell. So, but all these collections are important, and they're all mentioned in the Hague Convention. So what's happened since then has been really difficult. The Arab Spring and what a lot of us call an era of persistent conflict. And so this is where we go beyond the monuments men. Intentional destruction of cultural sites, especially of Sufi Islam in Mali during, Mali's excuse me, civil war that went into a multi-factional conflict. And so and I want to just point up a few areas where the Smithsonian, working with colleagues, working with other museums, in this case, working with the International Council of Museums, we did a workshop for Malian cultural heritage professionals and some from even some neighboring West African countries on what you can do to protect your cultural sites if you are facing an armed conflict and facing the possibility of looting. And I have to say, some of our Malian colleagues were really good at hiding their stuff, and they had a lot of advice that I learned a lot from them. The Syrian conflict has been going on for years and years and years now, and when I first got to the Smithsonian, we had, at the Blue Shield, just created the first Syrian no-strike list and given it to the Defense Intelligence Agency in case we became involved in bombing during that conflict. And little did we suspect that before long there would be, the rise of ISIS and this multi-factional conflict again in Syria going on for literally years. And we worked with a number of Syrian expat colleagues, as well as, you can see, a host of cultural heritage and academic organizations to create the Safeguarding of the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project, or what we call SHOSI. And so one of our best moves we ever did was early on, we went to Turkey, and our Syrian expat colleague, Dr. Salam Al-Kuntar, got Syrian colleagues to come across the border back when it was still pretty easy to do that. And we did a training for them where they learned about cultural property protection in wartime. We literally used one of the training guides that George Stout helped write in World War II about how to protect cultural sites. We went to the hardware store, we shopped, we came, we saw, we shopped. We bought lots of tools, materials. Here we're buying bubble wrap. We found bubble wrap in this small town in Turkey and gave it to our colleagues. They drove it back across the border. We gave them money to be able to hire workers to do the kind of work that they needed to do. This is the Mara Museum. It's filled with all these beautiful mosaics. They had a plan. They put glue on the walls, they put a facing over that, and then they sandbagged it. It might not be as pretty as the Last Supper sandbagging, but it worked. This museum has been bombed multiple times since then, and I won't say everything's perfect, but the most important mosaics that got this treatment are still intact even today in Idlib province. We saw ISIS bombing important cultural sites in Iraq. This is the Nimrud archaeological site near Mosul, which is really tragic because this was one of the most complete Neo-Assyrian palaces in the world, and it's got objects from that site have been collected all over the world because basically in the 19th century there was so much of the material, but also there was this thought that it was proof of the Bible because Nimrud is actually mentioned in the Bible. And so you have even here at the Nelson-Atkins a fabulous example of a frieze from the palace at Nimrud, which I saw as a kid. My dad told me it was hieroglyphics, but so he can be forgiven for that. It's cuneiform, people. Hieroglyphics is Egyptian, cuneiform is Neo-Assyrian. But so we're lucky for that, but we've lost so much. You can just get a sense. They took barrels, filled them full of explosives, and daisy-chained it throughout the site and blew it up. So the good news is what we can achieve out of that devastation is that the Smithsonian has been working with Iraqi colleagues to train them to do the salvage very much the same way they salvaged artworks during World War II. And this is just one example. They're picking up and cataloging the exact locations of where they find these fragments. We've built them warehouses on the site, and they are actually picking up the pieces, and they're going to rebuild. We're also working at the Mosul Museum. We have a project, and I should have mentioned the Nimrud project is, you always have to thank your sponsors, is being generously funded by the U.S. Department of State, and then we also have a number of people who support the SCRI program, including the Mellon Foundation, the Bank of America. So we're always grateful to them because they support our operations everywhere we go so that we can do things less expensively with our other grant money. So the Mosul Museum project is in partnership with the Louvre Museum in Paris and also with the Mosul Museum and its staff and the Iraqi government. And we saw the devastating ISIS destruction of the objects there. And yes, many of the objects were real. There were some copies, but the vast majority of what was destroyed was real. And we were very fortunate through funding from ALIF, which is an international fund created for the protection and recovery of cultural property in armed conflict. Just a couple of years ago, we got a grant to work with the Mosul Museum, and I was fortunate enough to travel there with my team only about 2 weeks ago on 2 separate missions to help them with the documentation of the damage as well as doing some emergency measures. And then we had a structural engineering assessment, because as you see, when ISIS blew up some of the pieces in the museum, they created a hole so big, this is 6 meters by 3 meters, that we were really worried about the structural integrity of the building, and they also burned the basement. They completely burned more than 20,000 volumes of the library, et cetera. So this is essentially how we found it. Our colleagues working at the Mosul Museum have also been working with us at the Training Institute in Erbil for years, and so they knew that this needed to be documented by an international team in order to make sure that if there's ever a legal proceeding like a war crimes tribunal, that we would have the proper documentation. So this is me with one of my colleagues, Kent Severson, a conservator. They're working with the Iraqis to do the documentation. And hopefully someday The museum will be restored. The structural engineers think it's quite possible and a good candidate for that. But what I want to see also is justice for my Iraqi colleagues and what they've lost. These lamassu used to stand at Nimrud, fabulous examples, and they've been blown up and defaced. The faces of the gods there have been completely scratched out. And so we want to see justice for that. So what can museums do? You heard what they did to prepare for World War II. What can we as museums and their supporters do today, and our cultural property colleagues, to continue to cherish that memory? But we have today's armed conflicts, and there's this exhibition about provenance upstairs, Nazi-era provenance, but unfortunately, today's conflicts are tomorrow's provenance problems, because in the Mosul Museum, for instance, many objects were taken. They weren't smashed up. There was, a show smashing for the video cameras, but many of the objects have been looted, and those will be showing up on the market. Many archaeological sites are being looted that will probably show up in the market in the future. So what can we do? More professional training and development. That part about stomp, that we have a responsibility to protect our collections during peacetime and have a plan for the possibility of disasters, whether they're tornadoes, floods, or armed conflicts. And so we have a training program at the Smithsonian called HEART, where we try to do this. We try to offer an annual training, and it's been funded by NEH and the Mellon Foundation the past couple of years, and we're hoping to keep doing that and expand on that regularly. And our participants come from all across the country. And I'll just point out, this participant on the left was from Puerto Rico, and then immediately went home and trained Puerto Ricans who had just been through the hurricanes of 2017 in this particular case. And then she was one of our teachers when we went to the Virgin Islands to do it for them too. So that's one thing. We have an international training program called First Aid for Cultural Heritage in Crisis, and this is each year it's offered about 25 places. We usually have about 300 applicants. We hope to be able to expand that more. This is a couple of years ago when we did it at the Smithsonian. And raising public awareness. I think the exhibition here, the Discriminating Thieves show, really does help raise public awareness. More Monuments Men movies maybe will help that too, I hope. And then scholarship about what happened during World War II, and understanding more about the illicit art market and how it operates today, and there are a number of academics who are studying that as well. Following guidelines on ethical collecting. All museums should be doing that anyway, but it's not always easy, and there's not always a lot of information out there, but this is the kind of stuff that I show to my classes when I'm teaching the military. You can still buy illicitly trafficked things from the Iraq Museum online if you are quick about it. Because of course they rapidly get caught, but it's unfortunate that 15 years later you can still find these things. So we have to be really careful about what we buy, and we have to be really careful about, even as individuals, it might not necessarily be illegal, but is it ethical? We always have to ask ourselves that question. It's illegal to import any Iraqi material into the United States right now under law, but there are other countries where conflicts are going on that are losing their cultural property every day, places like Yemen and Libya. So just think about that. Lending expertise. So we have a lot of the people who work at SCRI are Smithsonian staff, of course, but we also have volunteers like Kent Severson, who I showed you. This is him in the Mosul Museum trying to take a sample from one of the bomb blasts. He's a volunteer. We pay his travel, but his museum, Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design in Hawaii, they front his time. They let him do this on their dime because they think it's important. And then preparing a new generation of monuments men. This is training that we did at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a few years ago, and I hope that we can get museums more engaged in offering this kind of training and having relationships with the local military. Here in town, you have the 418th Civil Affairs Battalion, my old unit. Maybe they can come here and train sometime at the Nelson-Atkins. And then just, this kind of goes back to those maps I showed you that the ACLS created and the official map of France to be used during the invasion. Well, we created these like on the fly just before the US invasion of Mosul with its coalition allies, and then also right before Raqqa was invaded. And we worked with the University of Pennsylvania, the Blue Shield, the Smithsonian. We just put all of our knowledge together and whipped out these little handbooks. But wouldn't it be great if we could do it on a more regular basis the way we did during World War II, if we could really get academics and scholars together for that? So this is my last slide. Speaking of a new generation of monuments men, this was Harry Ettlinger a couple of years ago, and I'd just like to say I was very privileged to know Harry and get to meet him a few different times, especially when the monuments men won the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor a few years ago, and he passed away last fall. He's one of the last living monuments men, but here he is meeting a modern day general who is very engaged in getting the military to buy into the protection of cultural property. And I'll close with that and say that I hope we can live up to their ideals. Thank you.